Sharpo Marsh is the first wetland conservation project that is integrated into real estate development in Hong Kong. Sen Hong Gay Properties restored a 5-hectare marsh near Yuen Long Sharpo during the development of the park Yoho. Since the restoration began in 2014, over 108 species have inhabited the area, including the critically endangered four-spot mitigated Damselfly. How did the developer, government, ecologists, and landscape designers transform a degraded wasteland into a brackish wetland designed for damselflies?
I was interested in at that stage was birds, but I did a lot of voluntary work in birds and worked on a bird observatory in the UK historically in my early 20s. When I came to Hong Kong, I did a lot of voluntary work with WWF and MyPo, and then set up AEC 20 odd years ago, working with other more trained ecologists. And in terms of my role in the project, we started quite early on dealing with the town planning board application. So they had their approval for their scheme, but they had to discharge their conditions, and that included the update of the Ecological and the detailed design of the project.
What is unique about this project?
So it's a brackish marsh, which is quite unusual in Hong Kong. Most marshes are either entirely freshwater or entirely seawater. But this had both tidal influence and freshwater streams discharging into it. It's not an engineered wetland. A lot of them are human-induced anthropogenic land use changes. So the site historically was rice paddy back in the 1960s. So there was brackish water rice being grown there. So we knew that it was a wetland that was created using relatively simple water control measures.
How did the people with different professional backgrounds collaborate in this project?
In many ways, it was a fairly typical project in that the client subdivided each of the 3 components of the project in terms of the kind of ecology landscape interface, and just treated them as 3 different contracts, 3 different contractors. So there's very little overlap, which is obviously far from ideal. The main part of the marsh was basically handed over to the ecologist to design, because that was the key part of the site. There was a very rare damselfly type of dragonfly that occurs there, a thing called 4-spot midget. So our key requirement was to maintain the ecological functions of the site for that species. We worked very closely with the contractor in revitalizing the marsh. We were on site, and this is one of the key things is, as ecologists, we have to be on site on a regular basis, because there's not really any contractors in Hong Kong who understand wetland restoration or enhancement. So we're basically there on a regular basis, directing the people on the ground with the heavy machinery and stuff, and all of that, looking at the planting and micromanaging water levels, etc. Now, in addition to that, there is a more man-made landscape wetland that is part of the access to the site. That was given over to the landscape designers to design, and they came up with something that looks okay to begin with, but they didn't have any idea about future maintenance of the plant and what would survive in that area. We were very aware of the fact that the site was going to be paid for by the management fees of the residents, and that they needed to have some sort of access and recreational use from the marsh. So we took the more or less existing bund layout, and we upgraded those, and then we worked there. We did their work with the landscape designers, with all of the paving and the interpretation boards and stuff.
How do you define the issues on the site?
We did the baseline ecological surveys for the Ecological, and that was required as part of one of the discharge conditions, but also that information fed into the design of the marsh that directed what species we should be targeting. But it also, during that process, we obviously know the marsh very well, and became very aware of some of the functional issues. It was basically drying out. There was too much sedimentation going in, not enough water being retained within the marsh because it was slowly accreting. And a lot of the margins of the marsh, it was basically becoming more terrestrial habitat, being invaded by terrestrial grasses. So our key component was basically to maintain that hydrology.
How did you design the water system here to make it low-cost maintenance?
And that was what we spent a lot of our time thinking. So we installed a number of new sluices and quite a few, very simple water control structures using UPVC pipes. So we had to come up with a balance where we still maintained tidal inundation from a little creek that comes off the Camtin River, but also allowed for the streams, the two freshwater streams that flow into the marsh to continue to flow in. The key thing is, like I say, to be able to retain water levels. As soon as you lose control of your water levels in a wetland, you either risk flooding, and that causes damage to your bunds, your infrastructure, and potentially to your other adjacent water basin users. Or if you have too little water, you start the process of the wetland drying out, and then you have encroachment by non-wetland plant species, and then you have to deal with that. The longer your wetland is wet, then the longer you will have the vegetation structure that you want. And the ideal thing is to design a wetland so that you're doing most of that by gravity flow. Basically, as the water comes into the marsh, you set all of your water control structures so that once you're at a certain level, you start to discharge water into, for example, the creek in the Camtin River. So you basically want to minimize, your pumping. You want to minimize the amount of time people have to go around controlling water levels. The other thing we did was you also want areas of open water. So you don't want it to be completely covered in vegetation, because obviously that minimizes the complexity of the marsh and reduces microhabitats for different bird species and other wildlife. So in the same way that we want areas to be inundated or covered with wetland vegetation, those areas that we don't want, we have to make them deeper, basically make it too deep for plants to grow in. And that was designed probably, 14 years ago now, so it's still maintained as open water, so that's good.
How a wetland designed for damselflies or dragonflies differs from one designed for birds?
There's three key things. So the first, as always, is what species are you targeting? Usually we're looking at birds and fairly very mobile species. And as you might imagine, the more mobile species are a lot more tolerant of the types and the quality of the habitat that they're happy with. We had a very specific type of habitat that we had to maintain here. It was primarily the four-spot midget. Obviously, the next question is, how well do you understand the ecology of that species? And it's a very localized dragonfly in Hong Kong. Very, very localized, less than a handful of sites. It's a very isolated population. The nearest population to this is at Mai Po. And obviously, Mai Po's not that far away, but it's separated by, the highway, lots of residential areas such as Fairview Park, and these are very isolated populations. There's no movement between the two sites for the four-spot midget. And in some ways that makes it harder because the risks are much greater when you're dealing with an isolated, relatively small population of one type of insect. And that's why we took the approach to the hydrology so seriously. And this is quite a complicated one. And like I say, maintaining that mix of fresh and brackish water intrusion into the marsh.
Do you have any suggestions for students regarding their ecological design?
The only way you can have any ecological aspect to any green design, whether it is a landscaped area or it's an ecological mitigation area, is if you have a detailed understanding of the ecology of the wildlife that you want to occur there. You can't just go and design something and hope stuff's going to use it, because that doesn't happen, not in a meaningful way. Whenever we design anything from a butterfly garden to a mitigation wetland, it's always, okay, so what do we want to occur there? What do we think is going to occur there? So therefore, what are the ecological requirements for these species? And for a four-spot midget, it's going to be the vegetation structure and the hydrology. For a certain type of bird species, it can be whatever they feed on and whatever they want to nest in. For things like butterflies, it's going to be, what is the larval food plant? What is the nectar food plant for adults? But this is where historically a lot of landscape design and design of green areas fails in terms of the ecological potential of a site, because without that understanding, it's just a happy accident if you get anything of wildlife value there.
How is the current Chapel Marsh being monitored? Why do wetlands need long-term ecological monitoring after restoration design?
We're no longer working here, but we did work for about 4 years after we did the completion of the works. So looking at the management of the site after that, advising on the management, but also doing the post-enhancement monitoring. As you might imagine, the frequency of all of the monitoring drops off once everything's done, once all of the habitats have been reprofiled and everything is functioning properly. But if you don't do that monitoring, you don't have any real measurements of the health of your wetland system. All wetlands in Hong Kong really need management, because continuously you have vegetation succession happening. And even if you take wetlands like Mai Po, there's a huge amount of wetland management going on. So basically you need to be monitoring the four-spot midget, you need to be monitoring water quality, you need to be monitoring vegetation health, because you need like an early warning system for if things are starting to deteriorate. If you don't have that information, you're not really able to fix things before they get too serious.